Hi, I'm here with Dr. Helen Caldicott, who's from Australia and is a pediatrician and mother of 3, and you said you have 7 grandchildren. And I just would ask that you give me a little bit of background about who you are, because I think a lot of young people, and that's why I'd like to really draw attention to this issue, don't know necessarily as much about you as some of us do.
Well, I'm an Australian.
Okay.
I was born in Melbourne, Australia. I was conceived in Sydney, I heard, in Rose Bay, born in Melbourne. I grew up in times that I was born in 38, where there were no plastics, there were hardly any aeroplanes, of course there were no computers. We had a little tiny radio in our sitting room, no television, and I spent my life really, my mother used to lock us out in the morning and we'd play outside all day in the rubbish tip, chasing rats and climbing on blackberry bushes and picking blackberries, trying to derail trams coming down the hill, playing on the golf course, throwing crackers at guys just teeing off, climbing trees, making cubby houses, lying on the ground watching the ants and watching the wildflowers, climbing in houses that were just being built. It's a wonder we didn't kill ourselves, but we had a very, very free reign and tremendous independence, I guess, and communing with nature. You know, I can remember the spring and all the flowers coming out and how I just adored that. And I spent a lot of time with the neighbours when they had babies, watching them being breastfed, and always wished I could have a baby myself. So it was an interesting childhood, I suppose, and very free, very free. It was a bit scary when I was young because the Japanese were about to invade Australia, and Dad dug an air raid shelter in the back garden, which promptly filled with water. That didn't work, but we had blackout blinds and there were searchlights in the sky, and my mother was very scared we were going to be speaking Japanese, and of course they were so cruel to the Chinese and to our own soldiers, prisoners of war, so that was scary. And I know when I was 2, in 1940, Mum told me about Hitler killing the Jews, and I used to look out the window and see a patch of ground in the distance and think that was Germany, you know, how children... So right from the earliest age I knew, I guess, about war, and I knew about Hitler. When I was 7, I was at school and the fire siren sounded and the teacher said, "What's that?" And I was a bit precocious and I put my hand up and said, "The war's over." And we got a half holiday, and everyone was so happy. And I went home smelling all the flowers along the way. What I didn't know was it was ended by 2 ghastly, horrendous, genocidal bombs. And then I only recently realised my birthday is August the 7th, so I was born between Hiroshima and Nagasaki days. And then what turned me on, I was always very curious about the body. If you drink water, where does the urine come from? That sort of thing. Basic questions. And when I was 11, I decided I wasn't going to be a teacher. I was going to be a doctor because I could help more people. And my heroes when I was a little girl were the Good Samaritans. And I used to lie in bed telling Dad about they banged his head, and then 2 people walked past and ignored him, and then a man came by and bound his head with bandages and oil and stuff. And Robin Hood was my favourite book, and I read that about 10 times. I loved it. And so I guess they were sort of my 2 background heroes. And then when I was about 17, I read a book by Neville Shute called On the Beach, which was about a nuclear war, and everyone died, except people in Melbourne, and gradually they died too. So I lost my innocence, or I would say my virginity, that instead of smelling the orange blossom and always thinking about falling in love, which I did all the time, as my hormones were circulating, I knew that, you know, I could be blown up in a nuclear war. And then I went to medical school age 17 and learned about radiation and what it does to genes, and how if you're a Drosophila fruit fly, you can induce a gene for a crooked wing that is passed on generation to generation. And at the time, Russia and America were testing weapons in the atmosphere, and there was a hell of a lot of fallout in the Northern Hemisphere. And I couldn't for the life of me, as a young medical student, understand why these men were doing this, irradiating a whole population, when I just learned about it in medical school. So that was the beginning of my career. I am fundamentally and throughout my soul a doctor. It's like being a nun. It's my vocation. And for me it's a very sacred profession, that people will take their clothes off and expose their naked bodies and tell you their most intimate secrets. It's a great privilege to be a doctor. So the work I've done always, although I've done a lot more in medicine, in cystic fibrosis, and I was on the faculty at Harvard and the like, has always been about preventive medicine, and that's how I think about the planet as a patient, and that it's in the intensive care unit. So I only think as a doctor, and people say I'm a radical and I'm this and that. I'm nothing, I'm just a doctor. I'm actually a conservative because my life has been spent trying to conserve life and preserve and protect life.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Talk about your medical, the importance of that and taking care of people. That's really where it comes from, trying to save lives. So I know I've read in places that you said it was on the beach that really motivated you to move to action. When was it exactly that you became, that sort of became what you had to do, your passion to?
Oh, I was 17.
When you were 17.
Oh yeah.
You knew you would do anti-nuclear work.
No, I didn't know I would, but I used to stand up in the refectory at lunchtime at the university and try and talk to everyone about nuclear testing and stuff, and the blokes would look up from their poker game and say, "Who's that mad Sheila?" Sheila is a derogatory word for a woman in Australia. And I knew that that would have no impact, so that shut me up. And it wasn't until I moved to America till 1966 with 3 babies under 3 and a dying mother, and lived here for 3 years and watched the anti-Vietnam War protests, the civil rights movement. Right. Martin Luther King, Kennedy were assassinated, Nixon was elected, and I saw a democracy in action. And that, I just knew what democracy meant then. And I went back to Australia where everyone's frightfully nice and really, I suppose in a way conservative, although if Australians get a bee in their bonnet, you can't stop them. They're extremely creative. And in fact, during the Second World War in New Guinea, when the Americans were losing battles against the Japanese, they'd get in their trenches and hold a digger's hat up on a stick to frighten the Japanese, thinking that they might be Australians. So we're pretty tough, and we've got a lot of initiative once we get going. But I was really, it moulded my life living here during the 60s. It was just I never participated, but I read voraciously, and I read the New York Times every day, listened to NPR and the like. So
at what point did you kind of shift your directions? You kind of, I know you became full on ahead with the anti-nuclear work.
Well, when I went back from America to Australia in '69, my mother had died. I was deeply depressed. I was going through the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, depression, anger. And then I read Germaine Greer's book, The Female In, which was a fundamental moment in my life where I realised that I could speak my truth and that I never needed again to please anyone, that I didn't have to conform, and as we'd say in Australia, bugger it, I'm going to be me. And I had this white-hot certainty and anger associated with grief, but also with what was happening to the planet. And so I was able to focus that, and no one put me off. And it was such a relief not to have to flirt or please or do anything. And I wrote a letter. I found out the French were testing bombs in the Pacific, in the atmosphere, and there was a lot of fallout in Adelaide, and so I wrote a letter to the paper, which they didn't publish. So I rang the man and said, "Where's my letter?" And he was very condescending. He said, "Well, madam, we get hundreds a day." And I said, "Yes, but mine is important." And I talked him through it, and he then published it, and I was invited to speak on television that night. And so every time the French blew up another bomb or got fallout, I was up there talking. And I made mistakes, you know, because I didn't know everything about nuclear weapons, but it didn't matter. The way you learn is to step out and make mistakes, and then you learn by not doing that again. That's what you do in medicine, actually. Hoping you don't kill a patient, but You know, we're all fallible. And in 9 months, I educated the Australians. I found they had deep resentment towards the French. They think they're arrogant and were furious with them for coming down to the Pacific to blow up their bombs. And I went and saw the French government with our Deputy Prime Minister, and they said their bombs were perfectly safe. So our Deputy Prime Minister said, well, why don't you blow them up in the Mediterranean? And they said, mon Dieu, there are too many people living around the Mediterranean. So as a young doctor with 3 little children, I realised that I was sitting opposite wicked men who didn't give one goddamn if kids died in Australia of leukemia from the tests. And that was another turning point in my life. I saw wickedness, and I'd never seen it before. I'd never seen it before, face to face. And anyway, the Australians rose up. It was just huge. And they wouldn't deliver French mail, they wouldn't buy French perfume, they stopped buying French wine. Whole pages of letters to the editor about those bloody French. And so we took them to the International Court of Justice. We forced our Prime Minister to do that, along with New Zealand, and they were forced to test underground. So I learnt then what Jefferson said: an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. So by purely teaching, but of course you have to have access to the media to educate a democracy.
That's so true.
And where does Murdoch come from?
Australia.
Australia. And how dangerous is he?
Very.
Broadcast to 2/3 of the world's population. Did you ever know of a man called Dennis Potter, who wrote The Singing Detective?
I don't know him.
Oh. Well, it was a brilliant TV series about a man who had severe psoriasis, skin disease, and he used to fantasize. Brilliant. It was Michael, what was his name, the actor who played him?
Caine?
No.
Before him.
No. He's still around. Brilliant. Anyway, Dennis Potter was a British man, a Brit we would call him, who understood deeply the wonders of television and how it could be used to educate people, the potential. And this interview was with a BBC man, and Dennis Potter had psoriatic arthropathy. That is, it's much worse than rheumatoid. His hands were sort of fixed in a claw-like position, and he was dying of pancreatic carcinoma. And in one hand he had a morphine flask like that, and the other hand he had a cigarette. And he gave this interview, and it's the sort of interview that you would want to remember every word till you died. You want to bottle it and formalise it to keep it. And he said, I'm dying. He said, I can drink cream. And he's puffing on a cigarette. And he said, there's a blossom tree outside the window that's the blossomingest blossom I've ever seen. And then he said, he called his cancer Rupert. And he said he's the most dangerous man on the planet. And that was nearly 20 years ago.
Wow.
He died soon thereafter. But he is.
Wow. Wow.
And it's amazing how people watch the absolute garbage that he puts on that Fox television. People like Rush Limbaugh should be banned. We can't have people lying about the future of the planet. We can't have people lying about science. If I lied about medicine, I'd be deregistered. I couldn't practice it again. I'd be killing my patients. Well, we're killing the planet by having people on like that. It's wicked.
It is wicked.
No, it's evil.
Can I ask you a little bit about the 1980s and what the major goals were of the nuclear freeze movement? Were they accomplished? What was accomplished? What wasn't? And then we'll move on to the present.
When I first came to America, I came in '66, but when I came back in about '78, and I learnt about the fact that there were thousands of weapons ready to be launched by a press of the button, and there still are. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, I used to talk to people about it, the Americans, thanks so much. And they say, oh, well, it's better to be dead than red. I mean, the anti-communist paranoia was unbelievable. Talk about pathological, it was more than pathological. I mean, pathetic. I said, you'd rather be dead? Yeah, we don't want to be communist. I remember when I came in the 60s, the immigration guys would say to me, you communist? I didn't even know what a communist was. I mean, should have spat in his face.
Right.
How dare he ask me that? And even if I was, what business was it of his?
Right.
Anyway, so I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? They'll be killed too. The whole world will be destroyed. And they said, well, yeah, it's better. They don't want to be communists either. And I thought, this is absolutely nuts. So I formulated Physicians for Social Responsibility and almost single-handed recruited 23,000 doctors by just going to hospitals and doing grand rounds, and they'd all join. And I'm still doing it. And then we started having symposia on the medical effects of nuclear war with guys who had designed the bombs in the Manhattan Project. And they were very significant. And the media couldn't understand. They said, what are doctors talking about nuclear war for? And we said, well, this is a medical issue. This is the greatest, would produce the greatest epidemic of the human race. Oh. And so, you know, we'd get front page covering in the Boston Globe with the concentric circles of vaporization and third-degree burns and the whole thing, and the Catholic bishops would wake up and look at the Globe and say, my God, I don't think Jesus would like this. So they wrote a pastoral letter against nuclear war. Suffice it to say, we had symposia across the country, and they were packed out. People were scalping tickets at the door. And I had an agent who worked for me for free, Pat Kingsley, who was the best agent in Hollywood, who represented the leading film stars. And she saw me speak, and she said she'd work for me, and I said, I can't afford to pay you. And she said, we don't have to. She got me in Vogue, Lifetime, Ladies' Home Journal, Family Circle. She got me on 60 Minutes, Merv Griffin, Phil Donahue, and the way she'd do it was say, look, you can have Lily Tomlin and Sally Field if you take Helen Caldicott. Well, who wants a boring old Australian doctor in a tweed suit talking about nuclear war? That would depress the audience. But when they got the film stars, they were that hook that Pat hung my hat on. And I had huge press coverage. And that was what turned the country round. So that in 5 years, from everyone supporting the concept of nuclear war, 80% opposed it. That was the second American Revolution. It truly was.
It's extraordinary.
Not the Vietnam War movement, not the Civil Rights movement. It was that one, 80% of people. And I saw Reagan. I spent an hour and a quarter with him, holding his hand, trying to teach him. His IQ was about 100. I came out saying that I thought he had impending Alzheimer's, which he did. But he then started working with Gorbachev, and by God, they got together in Reykjavik in Iceland and almost agreed to abolish nuclear weapons. Almost agreed. So there's a precedent that two mere mortals could abolish nuclear weapons between the superpowers. And right now, of the 22,000 H-bombs in the world, Russia and America own 97% of them. So who are the real rogue states? Russia and America. And they're friends. What is the axis of evil? Russia and America. How dare they threaten to destroy life on Earth? For what reason? Because they have inadequate testosterone? You know, maybe they all need some Viagra in their water supply. I don't know. But we are in a serious position, much more dangerous than during the Cold War, because A, the Russian early warning system is dilapidated and falling apart. B, because they're paranoid. C, because the policy still in the Pentagon is to fight and win a nuclear war. And the way you do that is you knock out Moscow, so Putin can't press this button. Then you target, within seconds, all the Russian missile silos and drop 2 hydrogen bombs on each missile silo to kill the missiles. Millions of people dying. That's called collateral damage by the Pentagon. And there are 2 men in each missile. I just flew over the missile silos in the Dakotas. Hundreds of them you see from the air.
So frightening.
2 men in each one, armed with a pistol, one shoot the other if one shows signs of deviant behaviour. Get that. And the lock is 12 feet apart, so one man can't launch the missile, but if they've worked out if you tie a string to one lock key, you can turn that You know, and there are computer errors, and things are computerized.
Now, this was
Thousands of them right now on head trigger alert. How dare they do that? Why? And nobody knows. Nobody has the guts to talk about it. It's the elephant in the sitting room that stinks.
Why? Why is that?
Well, I think partly because when the Cold War ended, everyone, including me, thought, thank God. Oh, and my husband had just left me anyway, so I couldn't think of anything else at the time. But we were so tired. And we thought, of course, if Russia and America are now friends, you know, they'll get rid of the bombs. Well, George I did get rid of a few, but Clinton got in with no guts, no spinal cord, no courage. He had smoked some dope. We didn't inhale, right? Like he didn't have sex with that woman. And he'd never been to Vietnam, so he had no courage to take on the Pentagon. The Pentagon are tough. It's full of sociopaths, you know, brilliant men with no moral conscience, like Rumsfeld. And he did. I mean, he could have flown to Moscow in Air Force One. We handed him the facility to abolish nuclear weapons on a silver platter. 80% supported it. And Yeltsin was a hardened alcoholic and totally compliant. You could have said, Boris, sign this, we're going to abolish nuclear weapons in 5 years, and he would have done it. If we're blown up tonight in a nuclear war, and I'm not exaggerating, it's Clinton's legacy to destroy life on the planet. So he marches around the planet, gets paid $250,000 for a speech. How dare he? Where are people's heads?
So how can we solve the problem now? Do you have a plan in mind? I left the rally yesterday feeling like, okay, let's get off of Facebook, let's get off of no more TV, let's take action. What should we be doing?
What is happening is Wall Street is extremely significant.
Okay.
No one knows where it's going to go. Dad used to like a thing called E-Poppity, everything is something on the motion of the ocean is really nowhere, so follow the stars and follow the moon. We don't know where we're going, but we'll be there soon. We don't know where we're going, but we'll be there soon. So I think that's what's happening at Wall Street. People are fed up with these blasted corporations running the government, but it's their fault. This happens to be a democracy. People have the audacity not to vote. How dare they not vote when people are dying in countries to establish a democracy? In Australia, voting is compulsory. Everyone votes. But that's not enough, because once these characters are in Congress, no one goes to see them. No one says, okay, I'm your leader, you're my representative, you do this, this, this and this. And by the way, read the book and educate yourself.
Exactly.
So into that vacuum move the corporations who say, hey, want $150,000 for your next election? And that's how the country's run. It's absolutely and totally and utterly corrupt. Yeah, but it's the fault of the people, because they've got no flaming guts. They're spoiled stupid. How do you mobilise a country with full bellies? Yeah, it's true 20 million have no jobs. It's true that 50 million have no health coverage at all, which is obscene in the richest country on earth. But it's still not enough to mobilise people. And well, I mobilised them in the 80s and they had full bellies.
You did?
So it has to be done through the media. So therefore the question is, and I'm not talking about Facebook, and I'm not talking, because there's such a range of rot on the internet, plus some really good stuff. How do you discriminate without a really critical mind and without a lot of background knowledge? So we've got to do things that will dominate the media. Now, the fact that the NYPD arrested all those people on the Brooklyn Bridge last night is fantastic. The more they put people in jail, the more the average person is going to get incensed, and people will pour in there. I hope it's the beginning of a kind of American Tahrir Square. But they also have to be focused, and they've got to focus on 3 issues. One is abolishing nuclear weapons, because they do not realise that tonight it could happen. And it will cause the end of life on Earth. They don't realise that if Indian Point melts down, New York's gone. Won't die immediately. People will be lingering on, dying, bleeding to death, vomiting, diarrhea from acute radiation illness, dying of leukemia, bleeding from every orifice, dying of cancer metastasizing to their brains and their livers and stuff over years. New York will be uninhabitable forevermore. There are 104 reactors. They all have to be closed down. And global warming, that's when you've got to get the oil companies out of the pockets of the Congress people and senators, out of their pockets, out. They have no right to be in Congress. Oil companies, gas companies, coal companies, and nuclear companies, out. And the $1 trillion that are being spent a year on weapons, on mass death, which is more than wicked.
What?
More than wicked. And I'll tell you why, because Lockheed Martin runs the Pentagon. Lockheed Martin is a huge corporation making the global gas oven. That's what they're doing, and they're weaponizing space too. And Boeing's right into it. And Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, and all of these companies are stealing your money to blow up the planet. Oh, but it's, you know, national security. Da 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 da. And bombs bursting in air. Well, that's appropriate. That's what it's about. And it's a form of tribalism. And it's because the nuclear age is so profound, it has signalled the end of war and killing. Because if we keep killing, we'll use the weapons and we'll blow ourselves up. And I once asked Carl Sagan, did he think that there was life in the universe, other life? And he thought for a long time. He said, no. And I said, why? He said, because if any species had evolved to where we are, they would have destroyed themselves. So the question is, are we an evolutionary aberrant? And the more I think about it and the more I observe, the more I think we are. So I want to write a book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them, which I think will be very interesting.
I think so too. Can you say more about that? Yesterday you spoke about women need to rise up. And I also, you know, you're a mother, and I think you know, a lot of women do feel this maternal need to protect their young. And
it's
not
the
that
strongest
men don't,
instinct that people have. Yeah, well, we're pathetic. We're 53% of the Earth's population. We do 2/3 of the world's work. We own 1% of the property, and we have all the babies. And we let men do clitorectomies on us. We let men cover us up, so all we can do is see, you know, our eyes are exposed. I mean, what are we doing? What about going back to Laser Strata, where the men fought, and the women said, oh, okay, no more sex. Well, the men would have to either resort to homosexuality, masturbation, or behave themselves.
That's great.
But we've got no guts, and we need to mobilise, but not that, just that, but to come together and work together. And men need to be disciplined. They need their bottom smacked. All this killing, and you know, these poor little boys they send off to war as cannon fodder, they've hardly grown any whiskers. They're only little babies. And they come back either with no arms or legs, or severe head injuries, because they wear these Kevlar vests that protect their torsos, or with post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they never recover.
Or poisoned.
How can they?
Poisoned with various things.
Poisoned with DU and stuff. And it's just hideous.
It is hideous.
And it's for the old men's, you know, lack of being able to get erections or something. I don't know what the etiology is that causes these old men to send young boys off to fight their exigency battles. I don't know what it is.
I think it's actually a really interesting point.
Yes, I want to explore it.
That is very, very interesting.
That's so obvious, isn't it?
It is
Sticking
obvious.
out like, well, we've got a rude expression in Australia, I won't say, but yeah, sticking out like organ stops. It's so obvious.
Wow.
Well, and you have to work. I'm fascinated by Jung, man and his symbols, the subliminal symbols that society adopts without even understanding their rationale or their reason. You know, why is there a killer on a horse in every square in Europe?
So
They're all
true.
sociopaths. Why does Napoleon have a huge tomb in Paris? He was a sociopath. How many thousands or hundreds of thousands of human beings did he slaughter in the name of France? Alexander the Great. Why does this country glorify war? What is there about war to be glorified? It is hideous. Then you're going to get into, you know, Hollywood and those bloody awful videos. And it's all about blood and shooting women and shooting... But no psychological consequences of what it actually means. Hollywood needs its head cut off. I'm so sick of it. And I go to the films to see a good film like Win Win, which was a lovely film. And all the shorts are about these, you know, car crashes and banging, crashing and shooting, and it's all... I know that young males are the ones they want to attract because they take their girlfriends and they make a lot of money from their films, but how hideous and how inappropriate and how wrong and how evil. And then how does Hollywood use the Pentagon, or vice versa, to propagate the Pentagon's killing? I mean, the Pentagon lent them tanks and ships, and it goes on and on.
Yes, yes. So it sounds like, and I'm obviously very much in agreement with you, that women need to organize much more effectively to combat.
Yeah, but you know what we do?
this.
We ask men. We ask men, instead of saying, stand aside, you bloody idiots, you need your bottom smacked. We're taking over. You're about to kill all of us, our babies, our children, and yourselves. And I think men like strong women. They like to be disciplined. They like their mummies to look after them and make sure they behave themselves. And they're totally out of control. And I think the other thing is that 1 in 25 people are sociopaths. They're brilliant, charming, you know, they can do anything, talk their way into anything, but they have no moral conscience. So they're the ones that are so neurotic and driven that they rise at the top like cream in any organisation. And the two classical ones, of course, were Rumsfeld and Cheney. But you can see them in academic life.
Yes.
They slaughter each other psychologically. You see them in politics, you see them in the military. There are women too.
Yes,
but,
yes, yes. And they're
like
charming.
Thatcher.
And they're charming.
That's
so
right.
They're
Oh yeah, they can talk their way into anything.
Anything.
No moral conscience. So I think it's time to name these. I want to look at the etiology or the cause of the microbes infecting the planet, and that's us. But what is the pathology? And I think that, the emotions are engendered in the midbrain, and the neocortex is used to rationalise and justify the emotions. So when I said yesterday, when I talk, you know, I have to be non-emotional. Mustn't be emotional about millions dying. But these men are totally emotional, driven by their emotions. And then there's been a lot of work lately done on the influence of testosterone and oxytocin and estrogen and progesterone on the brain and on behaviour and on thinking. And that will come into it too.
Yeah.
Then I want to get into the churches. I mean, look at the Catholic Church. How obscene are they? These men running around in dresses with lace and stuff, and the Pope wears nice red suede shoes that I'd rather like to wear, dressing up like women, telling women what to do with their bodies. They've never had sex, or if they have, they shouldn't have, you know. How dare they? How dare they? And they're celibate, so that when they die, they have no family to leave the money to, so it goes to the church. And more than half of them are homosexuals anyway. But they sleep with the little boys, because that's not sort of seen to be sex, you know. Women are about sex. I mean, the whole thing is so obscene. And they don't recognise women. I mean, how dare they? Well, then why do the women take it? Now look at the Muslims. One man can have 10 wives and bloody 60 kids. That's obscene. We've got too many people in the world. We've got to stop reproducing. And the way they treat the women. In Saudi Arabia, they've just given women the ability to vote by 2015, but women can't drive cars. And they're the property of the men. I don't know why the women don't kick the men in the balls and get on with it. I mean, it's partly our fault for being so subservient. And that's what I learnt when I read Germaine Greer. I thought, right. And also I say, fuck now, because the men in Australia say it all the time. And I thought, well, why can't I say it? Just because I'm a woman? Yeah, well, that was very liberating.
It is liberating.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you just, because we don't have that much more time left, are there other, I know you do talk about other environmental issues.
Yes.
Could you just maybe frame a little bit what are the core issues that we need to be focusing on?
All right, so nuclear war, nuclear power, and then global warming, which encompasses everything. But I wrote a book in '91 called If You Love Its Planet. And it deals with overpopulation, ozone depletion, global warming, deforestation, desertification, toxic pollution, nuclear power.
It's a wonderful book.
Yeah, so I deal with all the major environmental issues in that book, and then I go into not just describing them, because you can describe them until the cars come home, nothing happens, but why. And as a doctor, you can't treat a patient who comes in with a multiplicity of symptoms unless you diagnose what is causing them. And then when you find out what is causing them, then you may be able to treat it. So why is it happening? So then I get into the media, the manufacture of consent, and how that's orchestrated by the PR companies, and how it was started by Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, who I once met. And he was an old man, and he told me proudly he taught women how to smoke. And I said, how? He said, I dressed them in beautiful green gowns, and I put a cigarette in their hand and put them in the pages of Vogue magazine. And I nearly vomited on him. So, yeah, and I look at the media and Murdoch and
It's a terrible story.
Oh yeah, the influence of all of how they manufacture consent, how people are anaesthetised by watching television, go into alpha wave activity. You don't think, all this stuff comes into you. Midbrain bypasses your critical faculties, and then you're conditioned to go out and buy the latest bit of crap. That's what happens, or think the latest way. So it is brainwashing of the most sophisticated variety. The most sophisticated psychologists work for Wall Street.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So and I've got a radio program called If You Love Its Planet that plays once a week on Pacifica and community stations and can be downloaded from ifyouloveitsplanet.org.
Thank you.
And I interview the most interesting scientists in all these areas in the world. And I've been really keeping a close eye on Fukushima too and what's happening there.
Yes.
So you can...
We will...
Yeah, but I cover all major environmental issues from a medical perspective.
It's such a very, very helpful perspective. It's very different than most environmentalists.
Yeah, I suppose that's so.
It is different. It's an important angle. As a closing, because I know we all have to finish soon, but is there anything you would tell young people that they should be knowing, thinking about, doing right now?
I would say that they must educate themselves. There's nothing more important than knowing about this stuff. I mean, it's important to become mathematically literate and literate in English, and to have done English literature and read Shakespeare and the great novels, to have an in-depth understanding of what life is about and what emotions are about, and falling in love and grief and death and the whole thing. But I would, and this isn't because I want to make money, because I don't make money from my books, they must read Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. They must read The New Nuclear Danger. They must read If You Love This Planet. And they must read War in Heaven, and maybe my autobiography, and learn them like I learnt Grey's Anatomy to become a doctor, because they are now all physicians in training to save the planet. And if they don't know that, they can't practice preventive medicine to save themselves and the 30 million other species. And I just end by saying I live in Australia. There are kangaroos hopping around my house. I came out the other day and there's one just sitting there looking at me. We've got goannas, lizards about 6 feet long. We've got echidnas, spiny anteaters that amble along. We've got lyrebirds that dance on their mound with a tail like a lyre, imitating every bird in the bush. We've got huge king parrots, red, navy blue and olive green, eating out of our feeder. I mean, And this is why I do the work.
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. I am so grateful to all that you have done.
Thank you.
And all that you're doing. You have no idea. I'm so, so grateful. And thank you for meeting with me today.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Heidi.